Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Worst Episodes of the Star Trek franchise. This is a series of videos that I'm doing where I do a separate video for each entry in my top 10 worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. So these are the episodes that I personally, just my personal opinion, that I personally considered to be the worst of the worst, and I really racked my brain to think of what is the absolute bottom of the barrel of this amazing franchise that had a lot of amazing shows and a lot of great episodes, but what is the worst? What are the things that really didn't work out so well for the franchise? And I am doing a full-length episode review for each entry in my top 10 worst. So this video is for my number 7 on my list, number 7 worst episode in my opinion, and that is Endgame, which is episode 25 of season 7 of Star Trek Voyager, the series finale, well, final episode of Star Trek Voyager. Now, if you are not familiar with my channel, this may be a shock to you or seem really out of place, because this is probably the episode on my top 10 worst list that is most beloved. I think this is the only episode on my top 10 worst list that you'll find in a lot of people's top 10 best lists. Well, for Voyager anyway, maybe not the entire franchise. But I've seen a lot of top 10 lists, of personal lists of people, they name their favorite episodes of Voyager. And this is on it. In fact, if I do recall correctly, I do believe that this is on the IMDb's, at least in the top 20 of the most highest rated episodes of Star Trek Voyager. And so, this one may seem a bit out of place. However, if you are familiar with my channel, then you might just be surprised that this is only number 7 and not number 1 on my worst list. Because I have talked endlessly about how much I do not like this episode. In fact, this is not the only episode review I've done. I've already done a full-length review for this episode. And when I say full-length, I mean full-length. Because that review was an hour and 40 minutes long. That's how long it took me to explain just how much I hate this episode. And not only that, but there was a running joke or running theme that every single time I did a top 10 worst list that this episode was eligible for, it was number 1 on that list. So I talked about this like numerous times, at least 8 times on my channel. That an hour and a half, 40-minute video I did just for this episode. It was in my top 10 worst episodes of Voyager. I had a top 5 worst list of Voyager, then I had a top 30 worst of Voyager, and then I had a top 10 worst time travel episodes, top 10 worst series finales. This was number 1 worst series finales, not just for Star Trek, but for any show ever. This was my number 1 worst series finale. So this is actually the first time, and I'm sure there's other worst lists too that I'm just forgetting about, that this was number 1. But yeah, so this is the first time I've ever done a worst list that this episode is eligible for, and it's not number 1. Because I was thinking about this, and I do, honestly, I completely 1,000% stand by that this is the worst Voyager episode. I stand by that this is the worst series finale of all time. But when I was looking at worst Star Trek episode, that had different connotations to it to me. And I definitely think it was definitely going to be in my top 10. That was for damn sure. I never doubted that. But should it be number 1? I decided not. I decided this, if you think of what is the worst Star Trek, this isn't necessarily the worst Star Trek. It's the worst series finale because it's a horrible way to end the show. Horrible, horrible, horrible. And it's a worst Voyager episode because it defies, it sort of spits in the face at everything Voyager stood for, and it sort of doesn't do the show justice. So it's definitely the worst Voyager episode, but not necessarily the worst Star Trek episode. Because if I just forget about the fact that this is the series finale, and to be fair, that is a huge reason why I hate this episode, because I do think it is the worst possible way to end the show. If I think about, forget about that it's a final episode of the show, then, I mean, it's still terrible. I think it still deserves to be in the top 10 worst, but maybe not quite as bad. Maybe not number 1. So, in fact, when I did my Voyager top 10 worst, this was number 1. But in my top 10 worst of the entire franchise, there's going to be another Voyager episode that's going to be higher than this, so I'm sort of switching things up for my Voyager thing, and that's my prerogative, because I honestly thought that other Voyager episode deserved to be higher on the list of worst all-time Star Trek episodes. But I stand by it's the worst Voyager episode, and I stand by it's the worst series finale, looking at those in particular. In fact, as far as series finales goes, like, yes, I think this is worse than Dexter. I think this is worse than Lost. And it's even worse than Game of Thrones, although I must admit that this and Game of Thrones finale were neck and neck, because I did a video recently where I did 10 worst series finales, and this was number 1, Game of Thrones was number 2, and for a while I was torn between them, but then I realized, judging it by the final episode of Game of Thrones, the very last episode, Iron Throne, that this wasn't as bad as this one. But if I judged it, compared it to the penultimate episode of Game of Thrones, which is called The Bells, then that would actually be worse than this one. But that's technically not the final episode. It's the second to last episode. So going strictly by final episodes, this is the worst. Now, as I said, I already did a review that was an hour and 40 minutes long, so I'm going to try to make this the condensed already, although it's already 7 minutes, so it's not going to be that short, but at least it's going to be shorter than an hour and 40 minutes. So this will be the condensed version of my review of Endgame, because I do feel like I talked and talked, and he keeps talking and talking like all Starfleet. You have no ground button. No, sorry. I talked and I talked and I talked about this episode, as I said repeatedly on my channel. Anyone familiar with any familiarity with my channel will be sick of hearing me talk about how much I hate this episode. So I will try not to ramble on too long, and I'll try to do my condensed version of why I hate this episode so much. But I did need to do a video because I did think it definitely deserved a spot in my top 10 worst. Now, I mainly want to talk about, because my sort of overall thoughts of what I hate this, why I think this episode doesn't work. And I think this episode is a sort of a representation of everything that's wrong with Voyager. Now, my thoughts on Voyager overall, I do love the Voyager. I think I put it as my third favorite Star Trek show, behind Next Gen and Deep Space Nine. Currently, I mean, if some of the newer shows get better, that may change, but currently that's where I'd rank it, like even ahead of the original series. Definitely ahead of Enterprise. Because there's a lot I like about Voyager, and honestly, that's why I hate this episode so much, is because I think this episode, the Voyager deserved better than this episode, basically. It deserved a proper ending, because it was a great show. Now, my personal feelings on Voyager is the first 2 seasons are my favorite. Although season 4 is my favorite, to be fair, the one they introduced 7 of 9. But other than season 4, the first 2 seasons are my favorite. And I think this finale completely neglects those seasons and pretend that they don't exist. Instead, they focus more on the continuity and the characters as presented in the final 3 seasons, which I actually don't think were as good. Now, there are some great episodes in those final 3 seasons. In fact, as much as I didn't like the final season of Voyager, in fact, I do think it's probably the worst final season of any Star Trek series if you don't count the original series, because that obviously takes the cake. But other than that, and some people, like to shit on the final season of Next Gen, but I actually really like that. I think that's underrated. This, I think, is clearly worse. But even the first half of the final season of Voyager was decent. It was actually a lot better than I remembered when I rewatched it recently. But part of the problem is that Rick Berman and Brennan Braga took over the show for Voyager in those final 3 seasons, which I think Brendan Braga is a decent enough writer, but I don't particularly think his writing style works when he has the reins. Like, he's great. He wrote some of my favorite episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise, mostly when he worked with other writers, mostly when he worked with Ronald D. Moore. But when he and Berman were put in charge of a show, and Berman, I think, is completely devoid of any creativity whatsoever. I talked about him repeatedly. I've heard all the shit. Not only was he an asshole to the cast and crew of these shows, I've heard a lot of cases of him being just a right out asshole to them. But also, whenever he threw his weight around and made executive creative decisions, most of the time they make no sense. Most of the time they're dumb. I think I've recently heard of one case where I agreed with, and that's when Ira Stephen Bear wanted to end Deep Space Nine by having it be all in Benny Russell's head, which is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. So at least Rick Berman was smart enough to override him there. But most of the other cases, when I hear Rick Berman overrides people, he just makes it worse. Like, for example, when they wanted to put the Doctor and 709 together in a relationship, which they had so much chemistry. The fans loved it. There was a lot of shipping. The actors wanted it. It really worked. And the writers wanted to do it, but Rick Berman said no! And why? We don't really know. And that is just one example of thousands, well, maybe not thousands, but at least hundreds of Rick Berman stepping in and making an executive decision to make something worse. Oh, another example is the Star Trek Insurrection, which was originally supposed to be a movie about the Romulans. It was going to be like that episode, Inter Armor Aim and Silent Legis from Deep Space Nine, which is an amazing episode. That should have been the third Next Generation movie, but Rick Berman said no, and instead we got Insurrection, which sucked. So it did, and again, there's many, many more cases. So why am I talking about that here when I'm talking about Endgame? And also, how's this really condensed version you're just babbling on? But whatever. The reason why I bring this up is because Rick Berman is solely responsible for this episode. He wrote this episode with Kenneth Biller. Now, I don't know much about Kenneth Biller. In fact, it's said that he kind of shunted away, because when you think of how an episode of Voyager is written, you think of a group of writers in the writer's room, collaborating, throwing out ideas, and typically that is how most episodes of Star Trek are written, but not this one. This one, apparently, Rick Berman and Kenneth Billard censored themselves and wrote this entirely on their own, although they did have some help from Brennan Braga. They helped them revise the script that they came up with after he finished working on all the previous episodes of the season. So Brennan Braga has some credits, but he wasn't heavily involved in the writing of this episode. And Brennan Braga, again, he has a lot of his own faults, but at least he is a decent writer. What I heard of Kenneth Biller, I don't know much about him myself. I heard that he was a terrible writer, but I looked at his writing credits, and there's some great episodes in his writing credits. He wrote, oh my god, he wrote Tuvix. Never mind, I take that back. He's a terrible writer. He was the only writer on Tuvix. But alright, he did write some good episodes like Detrell, and the Voyager episode Nemesis, not the movie Nemesis, the Voyager episode Nemesis, You're Nullified. Warhead, which is a great episode. And what else? Life Signs, I really love that episode, but a lot of these other episodes are kind of mediocre to bad, like Twisted, Elodrum, Before and After. God, I hate that. Oh, he helped write Worst Case Scenario. But anyway, most of the episodes I think are really good or decent. It says with other people. He wrote it with that person, with this person. So it seems like he's another one of those writers. And Tuvix, he apparently wrote that by himself, so that says something. But anyway, God, fuck Tuvix. Surprised that didn't make my top 10 worst. But anyway, So what I know of him, he's not that great of a writer. So Rick Berman, who is a terrible writer, by the way, who is more of a money man, he is not a creative mind. He censored and pushed away all the writers and wrote this alone. And basically, and there was a lot of interviews with Rick Berman when he's talking about this episode. He basically says that he purposely tried to recreate the sort of greatness of All Good Things. And that's exactly what this episode comes off as a lesser version of All Good Things. As someone who doesn't understand writing and doesn't have a creative bone in his body and doesn't understand the creative process, doesn't understand the deeper characters of Voyager, doesn't understand the deeper situations of this show, but is just trying to work off of graphs and diagrams on what is popular, what makes a great story. Okay, so All Good Things had time travel. Let's put time travel. And there are many cases throughout Star Trek where Rick Berman shoved time travel into something. The movie Star Trek First Contact is a great example of that, where he's just like, do time travel! Time travel is popular. You gotta put time travel in there. And so there was a decree made earlier on by Rick Berman that the final episode of Voyager had to have time travel in it. And something that Rick Berman and Brennan Braga both agreed on, that the final episode had to have the Borg in it, which is a decision I actually am very much against, to be honest. I don't think the Borg should have been in the final episode. But that's just me. But anyway, so basically, and you can boil this down, as I did in my hour and 40-minute review of this episode, you can boil this down to Rick Berman just basically, it's like he has like a bucket, and he wrote down all these ideas. What's popular? The Borg is popular. Throw it in the bucket. Time travel is popular. Throw it in the bucket. Klingons are popular. Throw it in the bucket. Oh, everyone liked that Barclay episode we did in Voyager, so Barclay is popular. Throw it in the bucket. What else is popular? Oh, starship fights. We gotta have some starship fights. Throw that in the bucket. And so it just comes off as like a hodgepodge of stuff that business execs think make a story great, or think, oh, this is what people want to see. But there's no creative soul behind it. There's no creative story. It's just a by the numbers action piece with lacking any sort of creativity. And by the way, this episode makes no sense. Episode has a redonkulous amount of plot holes in it. I know a lot of people are like, oh, you can nitpick plot holes on any episode. But here's the thing. If there's a really great episode, it might have some plot holes or nitpicks or whatever. But if it's a great episode, if you examine the core of it, it will reveal itself to be a great episode. If there's an episode like this one where it's nothing but plot holes and there is no core because the core makes no fucking sense, then it's not a good episode. It is flawed at its very core, for example. And I went into way more detail in my hour and 40-minute view, but just to speed by some of the examples of what's wrong with this episode is older Janeway's motivation for time travel makes absolutely no sense. She chooses at the end of season 7 to erase 16 years. And it's like, why didn't she choose a pilot episode to erase? And the reason is to change the timeline and give Voyager home. And the reason is because we saw those first 7 seasons, we the audience, but we the audience didn't see these 16 imaginary years, so we're not supposed to care about it just because we didn't see it. But really, the offense is just as bad. She is undoing a lot of good that Voyager could have done in the Delta Quadrant. They could have saved a lot of people. They could have made, a huge difference in Delta Quadrant in those 16 years. Also, in the recency states, is because 22 crew members died. Yet, I counted in my hour and 40-minute review, I counted how many people died that we know of in those 7 years of Voyager, and it was more than 22. So more people died in those first 7 years. So her motivation is really wacky. It makes no sense. It's entirely selfish just because her good friends Tuvok and Seven of Nine died, and Tuvok has a disease that made him mentally incapable, that if they got back earlier, they could have cured him. And it's a made-up disease we never heard of that really fits the plot convenience in this episode. But anyway, so she comes off as incredibly selfish. Now, I've recently heard the comparison of Kirk's motivation in Star Trek 3 of wanting to save Spock, that he risks his whole crew, his son died, although his son would have died anyway, regardless of Kirk's actions. But anyway, he risks his crew, he steals the starship, he gets them all court-martialed just to save one person's life. And I don't think that analogy fits. I think it's a totally different situation. Because Kirk is asking others to willingly go along with him, and it kind of makes sense that he'd be willing, and those who are close to Spock would be willing to risk their own lives in order to save their comrade. But this is completely different. Kirk didn't go back in time. Because this opens a whole can of worms of going back in time to change the timeline, and I made a really good argument in my video about how Janeway could have actually fucked everyone in the future. She could have changed the timeline for the absolute worst just so she could save her two friends. That is almost 100 times worse, 1,000 times worse than what Kirk did in Star Trek 3. It is irresponsible to the nth degree. And it's just to save one or two people that she likes. She's playing favorites. And I know that's not what Rick Berman was trying to do, but this episode was just written so horribly, that's what he did do. Now, and then of course the plot holes with the Borg, because this transwarp hub makes no sense, because it makes the Borg way more invincible than they should be, because they had this technology where they can instantly send as many ships as they want to Earth, yet in the past they only sent one ship that slowly approaches, where here they retcon it so they had this magical wormhole that can send them instantly to Earth. So why? And in the past episodes they keep saying, oh, we really want to assimilate Earth, that's their goal, oh, we're trying to assimilate Earth. And here, we see that they can send 100 ships to Earth instantaneously. Why haven't they done it? And plus, the whole goal of this episode is, we have to destroy this warp hub to strike a huge blow against the Borg. And when there's 6 warp hubs. So, oh my god, you struck such a huge blow to the Borg. How are they ever going to survive? Now they only have 5 warp hubs instead of 6. What a difference! So, and that was also my problem with Unimatrix Zero, which they mentioned in this episode. And in fact, they try to play it up in the future timeline, like the cadets are like, oh, we gotta study this historic moment with Unimatrix Zero. But again, who gives a fuck? It's just like, oh, this struck such a huge blow against the Borg, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't seem to do jack shit or really matter. So yeah, this episode is built on plot holes. The script is poorly put together, has a lot of scenes that are unnecessary or make no sense, such as the scene with Barclay and teaching the class with Janeway. That seems to serve no purpose, or Tuvok writing something down. Was he writing? Doesn't matter. It's just there to look cool. It's just from a professional script writing perspective. It's just a horribly written script, and the plot, as I said, the whole foundation makes no sense. It's just ooh, isn't it cool to see the Voyager going around with armor and fighting Borg? That's basically what the ship is. Or isn't it cool that there's time travel? We see the older Janeway and younger Janeway arguing with each other. Problem with that is we already had an episode that had 2 Janeways arguing with each other, deadlock, and it was only a billion times better than this. But now let me get into the main beef I had with this episode, and I do think is relevant, even though I said earlier I'm kind of forgetting about the fact that this is the finale. It's still a terrible episode. But it's even worse when you do remember that this is the finale. And that's why I say this is the worst series finales of all time. Now, a lot of people bring up the Enterprise finale. And even I've watched several reviews that also trash this episode and bring up all the flaws I just brought up. But they still say, well, it's still at least it's not as bad as the Enterprise finale. You know what? I know this is just my opinion, just me. But I think this episode is only a billion times worse than the series finale. I don't think the Enterprise series finale even comes anywhere close to being as terrible as this finale. I think this finale is like a billion times worse. Now, granted, I don't think that was a really good finale for Enterprise. But, honestly, I think that episode gets a lot more hate than it deserves. And I did a review on it where I said this episode actually isn't all that bad. Don't get me wrong, it's not a good episode. But I can kind of see what they were going for, trying to put Enterprise in the larger context of the Star Trek universe and end the show that way. Might not have been the smartest thing to do. And they did, the story did feel rushed with, Trip all of a sudden dying and the whole storyline with Sharan's son daughter getting kidnapped or whatever. It seemed like a silly thing to place the whole ending of the show on. And of course they shouldn't have had the show be about Riker, or the episode be about Riker, when that's not what the show of Enterprise is about. So yes, it's not a good finale, but in my opinion are very worse examples. And this Voyager one, to me, has so many more flaws. There's so much more wrong with it, and it's more disgraceful to Voyager as a whole. And that's why I'm saying how this doesn't work as a finale. What the Voyager finale should have done was honored Voyager. Was honored the time Voyager spent in the Delta Quadrant, honored the characters, maybe reconnected with the origins of the heart of these characters. And it did none of that. It didn't even come close. Didn't even try. As I said, this seemed like Rick Berman was saying, it is a shitty imitation of All Good Things. That's what it is. And All Good Things was it's one of the best finales of all time. I had it as like the second best in my opinion, but he could even be considered the best series finale of all time. And Rick Berman was trying to recreate it without understanding it. He didn't have any, because it's funny because you say, well, Brendan Braga was involved in, he wrote All Good Things and he was involved in this episode, but he really just helped polish it. He wasn't really heavily involved. And of course, All Good Things, you had Michael Piller, who's an amazing writer who came up with the concept, and then Ronald D. Moore and Brendan Braga worked with it together. Here, frickin' Rick Berman came up with the concept, and he censured all the other writers and wrote it with some Biller who's apparently not very good, and then got some of Brendan Braga's input. It's not the same. And anyway, basically Rick Berman was trying to recreate what All Good Things did without understanding. Oh, let's just have us future time travel. Let's have from the future. Let's see the future, and just like All the Good Things did. But you can't just do that. You can't just throw elements like the Borg and the time travel and say, "Ooh, that's cool." The reason why the time travel worked so well and Q worked so well in All Good Things is because it enhanced the story, enhanced the theme of honoring everything that came before in Next Generation, honoring these characters and concluding their storyline and telling what the show is all about. I have it on this poster beside me, which is the glare, and it's only halfway in, so you can't see it. But I have a poster where it quotes the end of All Good Things, says, "That is the exploration that awaits you, charting the unknown possibilities of existence." That's what Star Trek is all about. That's what the Next Generation is all about. Voyager, this thing does nothing to honor what this show is about. It does nothing to honor what these characters are about. It tries, and it fails. It tries to have the theme of, the journey is everything. The journey is more important than the destination. And they really fucked that message up. I'm sorry. This is something I got into more detail in my hour and 40-minute review as well. As And this is watching it again. God damn it, I had to watch this episode again. But I'm watching it again for this review. That again was reinforced. It really struck home to me how they overdid that. How Tom Paris didn't even care. I was like, I don't even care about getting home. He even said that Voyager's my home. Who cares about getting home? And B'Elanna actively didn't want to get back there. I don't want to go back to Earth. I want to have my baby on Voyager. I thought I was going to have it on Voyager. The problem is they're making it so the characters don't care about getting home. So if the characters don't care about getting home, then we, the audience, don't care either. So Voyager gets home at the end, and they immediately cut the credits, which one is the most. This is that alone, I think, makes this the worst series finale of all time. That was like the most offensive thing you could possibly do. I remember screaming at my TV when I first saw that, and I heard that described as the producer of the show basically saying to the audience, "Ha, fuck you! You don't get to see Voyager after I get home," which is, I think, the best way to describe it. So they don't. So. It seems to me the writers didn't really care about Voyager getting home. And in fact, I heard some behind the scenes where they were discussing should they get home. Of course they should get fucking home. That's what the whole show is about, you morons. And that's why I think the writers really lost track of what Voyager was all about. Now, here's the thing. I do think having a message that the journey is more important than the destination, at its core, that is a good message. And there's a way where that could have been done properly. But this isn't it. Not even remotely close to it. Instead of getting across the message that the journey is more important than the destination, it gets across the message, well, it doesn't matter if we get home. We don't really want to go there anyway. On second thought, let's not go there. 'Tis a silly place. Basically, that's what it says. And that just deflates all of the purpose, all of the fun, all of the emotion, all of the power of Voyager getting home. And if you're a fan of Voyager like I am, who watched throughout the first couple of seasons, which were amazing, because it had a sense of community, it really did a great job of hitting home on how homesick these people were, how separated from their families, how much they, really desperately wanted to return home, and how lost they felt and how difficult it was for them. And that's a sense that this finale does not acknowledge in the slightest. Now, I do grant that they've been on the ship for 7 years. They made Voyager their home so they would have so they wouldn't be as homesick, and they would have a different perspective on getting home. That's fine. And as I said, there's a way to play it where that makes sense, where they have an updated version of what it means for these people to finally return to Earth. But for characters like Paris and B'Elanna and other characters to be, and even Harry eventually said, I'm the one who really wants to get home, but fuck it, let's do a big huge blow against the Borg, which actually won't make a difference in the long run, rather than get home. So it's making all the characters not care. And that is how you deflate it. Now, one more thing I want to address, because I know I'm not doing a very good job of making this a condensed video. But one more thing I want to address is that I've heard an argument made before that showing Voyager after he got home would have been anticlimactic. And this episode was actually smart for having this future timeline where we got to see Voyager get home first. And that way we get a sense of what Voyager was like after return to Earth. And they could end the episode on a high note and not be anticlimactic. And I could not possibly disagree with that reasoning more, personally. And just in general, I love my stories to have a coda on the end. I don't like it when they just cut suddenly, generally speaking, with a lot of things. I like there to be a nice sort of finish to it, a sense of closure. But not only that, is that actually, I would argue that the opening scenes that shows Voyager getting home in the future, that's anticlimactic. Because the whole climax, or the whole thing it was about Voyager getting home, yet the episode begins showing you Voyager already home. So that's anticlimactic. That fucks it up. That makes the moment where they return home a lot less powerful because you already have a version. You already saw this version where they were home already. And so that is what makes it anticlimactic. What should have happened is they should have showed Voyager getting home. In fact, I had argued, and I'll continue to argue, that Voyager actually should have got home before this episode. I think it should have got home in season 5, but some people think that's way too early. Fine, let's say season 7, end of season 6 finale should have been them. Should have been a cliffhanger, and at the start of season 7 they get home, and then this shows them getting home. But at the very least, they should have gotten home in the penultimate episode, and the finale should have been about them readjusting to get home, because I think we deserved as the audience to see what their lives would be like after they get home. The very least that this show owed its audience, it owed this character, it owed the stories, it owed all the writers who wrote on this show before, the very least that they deserved was a 5-minute sequence of showing what it's like to get home. But this episode was so disrespectful of everything that came before it, so disrespectful of the audience who loved this show, they couldn't even fucking do that. So, yes, this is the most terrible series finale ever written, ever. And I think this is a good place to end this video, even though I have much more to say about it. But again, if you want to hear more in-depth thoughts of it, watch my hour and 40-minute video of this. And plus, I'm a bit too angry now to talk about this episode anymore. It is definitely one of the worst episodes of the entire Star Trek franchise. In fact, I'm starting to change my mind that it's only number 7 on my list. Maybe this should have been number 1 or 2 or 3. But whatever, I've already committed it to being number 7. So there you go. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this. Be sure to check out the rest of my top 10 worst list, where I continue to count down the absolute worst episodes, in my opinion, of course, of all of Star Trek, which I will release one every week, and there will be a playlist in the description below, which will have a playlist of all of my top 10, so if you want to see the other episodes in my top 10, you don't have to go searching for them. It's right there in the playlist, right below you in order. So anyway, be sure to check out my channel as I continue covering Star Trek. Do many more videos on Star Trek, as well as videos on other shows like The Expanse and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.